Imagine this. You're an aspiring game designer who has a passive fascination with the worlds of psychology, philosophy, and religion. In other words, you really like heavy topics and you would like to make a game that discusses those ideas in great detail. Over about half a decade, you work your way up in a very quickly growing game studio, and oh, hey, they're looking for ideas for the next game for their biggest series. You pitch the idea, but they say it's a little too dark for their big titles, but they are willing to let you develop the game with a team of people that have worked on similar types of games. Now, you've never worked as a development lead on a game before, so it's a bit challenging, but you have a ton of ideas that you think would be great. The plot is fairly complicated, and you think that that's going to get into the heavy topics in very interesting ways. The combat is also very unique amongst its contemporaries, and the graphics look great for the time. But then you look at the calendar, and all of a sudden, the game needs to come out in just a few months, and the content of Disc 1 isn't even finished. Hell, there are entire dungeons that need to be designed and integrated into the game's content. There are playable characters that don't even have full backstories yet. You just don't have enough time to finish the game like you want. Well, I guess it's time to finish the important parts and hope that it looks like a complete game. Really hope it doesn't turn out to be a complete waste of 70 hours. Wait. The game isn't finished, and it's still 70 hours long? How long was it supposed to be? Was it supposed to be 200 hours? Why does it end saying it's part 5 of 6? What the hell did you have planned? Maybe that story I just told was a little outlandish, but it's all 100% true. Tetsuya Takahashi, along with his wife, Kaori Tanaka, both avid fans of psychology, philosophy, and theology, submitted their idea for a game to Squaresoft as an idea for the upcoming Final Fantasy VII. They weren't too keen on putting something about God in their biggest title though, but Takahashi was given a team to work on it independently. That is the story of how Xenogears, then known as Project Noah, began. Now, this team was made up mostly of people that Square didn't want working on Final Fantasy, so you can imagine they might be a bit inexperienced and they would have trouble making a full game by themselves. Tetsuya Takahashi, despite being an artist and graphic designer first, had a ton of very intricate ideas that he wanted to include in the final product. A complex story dealing with abuse, religion, self-identification. That was just a small part of the game that was supposed to include 2 different combat systems, a fully fleshed out world that would change in between discs, and 9 playable characters. Just those 4 things alone would be a massive undertaking for a team of 30 people to crank out in a year and a half. Add in the 9 different antagonists, like 15 dungeons, well over 70 bosses, over 100 mecha that need to be designed and have combat ready, and a robot fighting minigame that definitely needs to stay in the game, and you might need an extension on that year and a half. So, Square gave them a whole extra 6 months in order to finish the game. That 6 months was spent primarily making that one robot fighting minigame. You know, maybe the team could have said no to a few ideas. It's a well-known fact that many games have to cut content because they couldn't get it to work or never had time to fully realize an idea within their deadline or budget. Games from around the late 90s to early 2000s are notorious for this, like how Metal Gear Solid had an entire multiplayer mode that got axed due to time constraints. Normally, what gets cut is a bunch of content that was deemed ancillary to the core game. Cut a few minigames here, maybe a side quest there. If you're really short on time, rework the plot so that a couple characters who were underdeveloped can be removed. Just keep everything that's necessary so the work feels very cohesive. This is not how Xenogears was made. The developers of Xenogears seem to have had a vague idea of how they wanted the game to progress, and made it in just about any order they wanted without having any real sort of plan. So instead of cutting this out, they cut out most of the plot. I'm not kidding. There are massive chunks of the story that are just narrated to you by the main characters while they sit in a rocking chair. There are multiple times where the game actually tells you about a dungeon that you could have played through and then skips to the end to just drop you in a boss fight that barely makes any sense and still doesn't really further the plot. In fact, once you make it to the second disc, you don't even get to go to the overworld again until you're about to go into the final dungeon. And yet, despite all of the missing content and the clearly wrong priorities that the development team had, there is something about Xenogears that brought a lot of people to love it. There are plenty of detractors that say it's just a bloated JRPG that doesn't really accomplish anything, but then there are the very devoted fans that to this day love the game and had some parts of their lives affected by the story and the themes that the game brings up. Some people even think that the narration portion of the game's second disc is an artistic statement that defies conventional game logic. The reputation that precedes Xenogears is so lofty as though it's one of the classics of gaming history. But is it really? Is the game truly this masterpiece of design and storytelling that Tetsuya Takahashi has been attempting to recreate throughout the rest of his game developing career?
No! Honestly, the game is kind of shit. The haphazard way in which the game was thrown together makes it so that there's no part that feels truly complete. While the combat is relatively fulfilling and fun, that's only in comparison to the absolute mess of a plot that was left behind. Almost too ambitious for its own good, Xenogears reads less like a forgotten classic with avant-garde storytelling, and more like a jumbled mess of different themes held together by a core game engine that can barely function, while the plot is trying constantly to say something meaningful, but can never focus on one topic long enough in order to ever be truly impactful.
Alright, before talking about the story and characters, we really need to talk about the game design itself. Xenogears has this neat idea where there are two separate primary forms of combat: on-foot combat with the characters, and mech combat that takes place in all of the characters' respective gears. On foot, combat is primarily affected by the character's levels and abilities, whereas gear combat is affected by the equipment you buy and attach to the gears. The on-foot battle has an action gauge of sorts that lets you string together different moves to perform powerful specials called death blows at the end of every turn. Similarly, gear combat has you manage fuel, constantly forcing you to judge which moves to use so that you maximize your damage output without costing too much fuel and running out before the fight is over. By learning new death blows, you also gain combos that the gears can perform. And honestly, they all look kinda neat. It all sounds really good, being able to combine different moves to do certain death blows that are perfect for the situation, but then after about 15 hours into the game, you start to realize that because the combat is poorly balanced, every fight just devolves into doing the death blow that does the most damage, and this just gets worse and worse as the game goes on. The same can be said of gear combat, where you just do the combos that do the most damage, and then you just never have to worry about fuel. Even the elemental death blows that you learn towards the end of the game don't really matter because the game seems to have mostly forgotten that there even is an element system. Outside of fighting the elemental Power Rangers, elemental skills just never matter. Once you have this realization that you just need to output the most damage all the time, combat becomes pathetically easy, and the only time you will ever feel challenged is when a fight is extremely gimmicky. Hell, I beat the final boss of the game with the strongest party member confused for about 6 turns, so he didn't contribute and I still never felt threatened in that fight. So the basic combat is bad, like pretty bad, but to make it even worse, the game seems to be really proud of the combat, because the encounter rates in the dungeons are exceedingly high. I don't know if they were trying to make dungeons feel longer than they actually were, but the number of encounters I would run into just trying to run down a fucking hallway was absurd. Not to mention that most of the dungeons end up just being a series of hallways, so combat just feels like it further wastes my time. So when you're not sitting in on one of the characters ranting about the nature of communal existence with other humans, you're running down a hallway fighting triangles for an hour. By the end of the game, I was struggling to find the will to power. The, Der Wilsermacht, if you will, through the end of the game, and I started to just run from almost every encounter I could, because levels don't matter once you are almost exclusively in gear combat. Speaking of not needing things, if you'll remember, I mentioned that this game has 9 different party members. They are Beifong Wong, Saitan Uzuki, Bart Fatima, Elheim Van Houten, or Ellie for short, Billy Lee Black, Emeralda Kasim, Maria Balthazar, Choo Choo. And Rico. Rico's here. That's an awful lot of characters when the most you can have in your party is 3 and you can't even switch out Faye except for during the final boss fight. Now, that is a bit clunky, but the real issue is that most of the characters don't have a purpose except for Billy. Faye, Saitan, Bart, and Emeralda are all characters who hit things really hard. Presumably, Saitan acts as an elemental defensive buffing mage, and Bart acts as an elemental offensive buffing mage, but both of them do so much damage and the elemental system doesn't matter, so you might as well use their turn to just hit stuff. Ellie is a caster, but since elemental damage doesn't matter, you just let her hit stuff, albeit less hard. Maria is the closest you get to having a summoner, but that just means that she hits stuff really hard with mana. Choo Choo is a fucking joke, and Rico is supposed to be a tank, but because this is an RPG in 1998, he has no way to draw aggro, and he's so slow that he basically doesn't do anything in combat, so he's absolutely useless, and this extends to his gear, which is basically him but bigger. Billy is the only mildly unique character because he fights with guns, and that gives him this kind of unique ammo system. He also is sort of a healer, so his identity in combat is actually fleshed out as the jack of all trades, but he just also hits stuff really hard. That being said, everyone pales in comparison to the Omni super god that is Saitan Uzuki, aka the person that most strongly invalidates all of the combat. Oh! And gear combat is much worse because no one has any unique skills beyond their animations and some minor buffing spells. So you just pick what does the most damage on the team and then steamroll. But what about the plot, you may be asking? Surely these characters are so critical to the story, and that's why they have to be in the party. Well, the thing about that, the combat is the comparatively good part of the game because, oh dear lord, this story is an absolute shambles after it got hacked away by the time constraints. While the combat is exceedingly boring and monotonous, it does still feel complete. The plot, on the other hand, didn't make it out in one piece. It's not just a matter of there being sections of the game that are turned into narration zones, there are just straight up points in the game that aren't told or have the pacing of a hummingbird on meth. Now, I think the best way to really explain the issues with the storytelling and themes of the game is sadly by going through the entire story of the game. So as quickly as possible, allow me to recount it as best as I can using only the most important parts. Beifong Wong is an amnesiac living in the rustic city of Lahan where his best friend is about to get married. Before the wedding starts, he visits his close friend Dr. Saitan Uzuki, who lives on a nearby mountain. Saitan then waxes philosophical before they notice what look like giants flying towards Lahan. They go to find some gears tearing everything up, and in a fit of rage and confusion, Faye boards one of the gears, mysteriously knowing how to control it, and then he loses control before accidentally blowing up the entire town. As punishment, Faye is branded a murderer and outcast, and he wanders into a nearby forest where he meets Ellie, who he for some reason subconsciously knows the name of. They argue over whether or not it's okay to run away from trauma before Ellie gets attacked by a dinosaur and Saitan shows up to save them. She then runs away in the middle of the night. Saitan and Faye get lost in the desert and run into Master Asia, Graph, Seeker of Power, who promptly tells Faye that he's a total bitch and then runs away after making him fight a sandworm. Saitan and Faye are then picked up by Bart, the displaced prince of Ave, whose sister, Margie, is held captive by the current leader Shakan, who is a puppet of the Solarian Empire. Everyone goes to rescue her, and they end up meeting the leader of the Solaris army, Ramses the Jerk, and his cohort Miang, who both seem to recognize Faye's fighting style. Everyone decides to then launch a full assault on Ave, the moon looks like shit, Ellie takes some drugs, Faye and Ellie have mental sex, and Graf continues to be the best character in the game. I am Graf, the divine seeker of power. Doth thou desire the power? My fist is the divine breath! Blossom, O fallen seed, and draw upon thy hidden powers! Grant unto thee the power of the glorious Mother of Destruction! Faye passes out in a mysterious red gear piloted by a mysterious man who seems to be obsessed with power, nearly kills everyone. Time skip to Faye waking up in an internment camp. Saitan finds Faye in the city of Nortune while he poses as a regular doctor as he waxes philosophical. Faye wins his freedom through the worst minigame in history, saves the city alongside Ellie, and then they escape and steal a super aircraft. Graf shows up to kick Faye in the dick, and then Bart accidentally shoots them down because he doesn't realize who's piloting it. Everyone ends up on the mobile sea city of the Thames. They get attacked, Faye realizes that he hasn't done anything in the last 30 hours of the game, and he falls into a coma after almost drowning. The party meets Billy, a gun-wielding zombie-hunting omni-priest who will help heal Faye back at his church. They end up fighting some zombies along the way, including this really big one. Billy turns out to be a total dork, and then they return to the church to find out that everyone is being murdered. Turns out the church was a total scam, and the god that Billy believed in isn't real. The religion was just a front for Solaris to conduct research on the surface. Oh, yeah, I forgot to mention, Solaris is a giant city in the sky. We then visit the underground city of Zeboim, which is made up entirely of hallways. While down there, the mysterious Red Gear attacks, and we're saved by Wise Man. Another mysterious man who pilots another mysterious gear. But this one is nice to Faye. Billy's dad shows up to turn into a gun and tell Billy that God was inside of him the whole time. Oh, and good news! Faye woke up from that coma. Everybody kills the bishop, and they decide to climb the Tower of Babel because it's the only way they can reach the city of Shevat. Another city in the sky, but I promise this one's good. Please ignore the fact that we have to climb this tower despite how gears can fly seemingly infinitely high. While in Shevat, 50 NPCs will tell you the backstory and a really cryptic message about how Deus and the Mahanan were where humanity came from. Whatever in God's name those are. We also learn about Omni-Gears, which are basically super gears that you can control with your mind. They then break 4 generators that were hiding where Solaris is. During that, they free Bart's kingdom in the process, pick up a child made out of nanomachines, and have the same 2 boss fights 2 times in a row. They then fly up to Solaris, split up, and decide to put the only 2 people that speak the Solarian language in the same squad. Everyone except Faye, Saitan, and Ellie get arrested. They then find Ellie's parents, who turn out to be moderately racist. The 3 of them then fall into the Soylent Factory, which, yes, does turn dead people into food. Saitan then watches Faye and Ellie eat the processed humans without telling them, and then when they find out 2 minutes later that they ate dead people, they suffer panic attacks, and Saitan just stands there. What the fuck? After going further in, the light shut out, and Saitan reveals that he was a double agent the whole time. He ties up Faye and hands Ellie over to Krelian, the secret leader of Solaris. Saitan then waxes philosophical for a bit before he breaks you out because he wasn't really a double agent the whole time. Now he fights with a sword that he wasn't using until now because fuck you. Krelian then just kind of lets everyone go for some reason. Graf and Miang try to stop everyone from leaving. A Ratman betrays you, Ellie's parents die, and then Faye starts to freak out. It is here that it is revealed that when he breaks down, he becomes a split personality id, the mysterious pilot of that red gear that nearly killed everyone earlier. He then destroys Solaris. We then have a flashback where Saitan waxes philosophical. After going back to Shevat, the Queen, in fear of the power of id, decides to encase Faye in carbonite. He and Ellie run away, and while heading out, they run into a highly deranged Ramses who has been given an Omni-Gear. Faye and Ellie then crash land in a forest, nearly dead. End of Disc 1. Faye and Ellie have the same dream about a previous life they both had 500 years ago. We get to see the immaculate Faye Fong Dong. We wake up in some old guy's hut who mended us back to life. Saitan then shows up and tells us to go fight for Shevat, despite how they were literally going to kill Faye 3 weeks ago. They destroy all of the Soylent systems that are still on the planet that Solarius and Krelian apparently still have, despite the entire country of Solaris blowing up. People start to mutate Third Impact style because of nanomachines. The party get a bunch of Omni-Gears, including one that Saitan had the whole time, but wasn't using because fuck you. Krelian releases the Eldritch, a ship that carried humanity here 10,000 years ago. Now for the super complicated backstory. Turns out that 10,000 years ago, a space transport vehicle containing a weapon called Deus crash-landed on the planet. All humans except for one of them died, and Deus became extremely weak, so a program called the Maya activated and started producing artificial humans that would eventually be turned into biomatter to feed Deus for his resurrection. Deus was originally created using a power source called the Zohar, which is basically a giant battery with an eyeball in it that can tap into the 5th dimension for energy. This ended up trapping the Wave Existence, a 5th dimensional being made of energy, inside of it. Faye is actually the most recent reincarnation of Abel, a human who came into contact with the Wave Existence before the Eldritch crashed on the planet. Any reincarnation of Abel is known as a contact. Ellie, meanwhile, is the reincarnation of a woman that Abel had wished for when the Eldritch was crashing, so it ended up being the first person that Deus and the Wave Existence created. The other notable contact is Lacan, a man who was in love with Sophia, a previous incarnation of Ellie, about 500 years ago. They were friends with Bart's ancestor and, surprise, Krelian, who is also in love with Sophia. During a war, Sophia dies, and Krelian, having never gotten to bang her, decides God doesn't exist and he will create his own vision of God to save humanity. Lacan takes a completely different route after Sophia dies, and under the influence of Miang, who is also immortal, please don't worry about it, seeks ultimate power and becomes Graf. Back to the present, the party boards the newly awoken Eldritch to find a database that tells everyone about how humanity was born. Krelian and Miang show up to kidnap everyone except for Ellie, who isn't there. Krelian then fucking crucifies everyone, including Choo Choo. Look at him! Ellie tries to save them, fails, and gets taken captive herself. Everyone then tries to rescue her. Ramses shows up and reveals that he is a dumpster baby that Krelian made in an attempt to create an artificial contact. He goes crazy and kills Miang, who then possesses Ellie's body and shoots Faye. Faye loses control over his body to Id, who attempts to go find the Zohar in the land of Bethlehem. The party tracks him down, and then Faye has an internal conversation with his different split personalities. Turns out that Faye, as a child, was fairly normal, and created Id as a way to deal with the trauma of his mom performing experiments on him when she found out he was the contact. Also, his mom was Miang. Please, I promise it makes sense. It's not weird at all. Id grew evil from being the one to deal with all of the horrible experimentation. The Faye that we know now is a separate personality that was created to contain Id from going too crazy, while the original child Faye just wants to relive the good parts of being a kid before he was being experimented on. Wise Man shows up at the Zohar to help deal with Id, but Faye just slaps his other personalities and then melds with them. He then reveals that he was actually Faye's dad, Con Wong, and then he double reveals that he was actually possessed by Graf the whole time. Faye and Graf fight now that Faye has unlocked his true potential. He has a conversation with the Wave Existence, who begs Faye to free him from the Zohar and Deus because he just wants to go home. Graf then stops the Zohar from eating Faye, and everyone goes out to kill Deus and free Ellie. Inside of Deus, they kill the core, and before it blows up, Ellie's soul tries to fly it out to space where it can blow up in one piece and not damage the planet. Faye chases after, argues with Krelian on the human condition, defeats Miang. Krelian then reveals that he just wanted to ascend to the 5th dimension where humanity would be free from its suffering. Faye says no suffering is what makes us human. Krelian then fucks off to the 5th dimension, the Wave Existence goes home, and now our party is free on the planet without any power source, and they have to repopulate the planet. The end. Or was it? After the credits end, there's a reveal. Part 5 of 6. There's gonna be so much more Xenogears! Now, for those of you that are fairly observant, you may have noticed that I barely mentioned Choo-Choo, Maria, Emeralda, or, oh shit, Rico. That's because they really have no importance to the core story. Choo-Choo exists almost entirely because the game wanted to have a mascot character. However, her relevance to the plot is that when Shavad is being attacked, Choo-Choo reveals that she can grow big and has healing magic that can heal robots for some reason. She then gets her ass beat and never talks again. Similarly, Maria is a small girl in Shavad who joins the party because her dad built a super gear called the Siebzen and that Solaris wants it. She then kills a robot version of her dad that is sealed inside of another gear that he built. Maria then never talks again. Emeralda is the most disappointing of the bunch. See, she was the colony of nanomachines in the shape of a human girl. She was built by another one of the pre-incarnations of Faye called Kim Kasim. The issue is that when you pick her up in a dungeon, she just does nothing for the plot afterwards. There's a small endgame side quest where you visit the underground city of Zeboim, but not the part that's made entirely of hallways. And you get a small cutscene explaining how and why Kim made Emeralda, and consequently why she calls Faye Dad. This flashback for some reason makes her turn into a sexy teenager, so you don't feel as bad for wanting to fuck her, and then she never talks again. The weirdest thing about it is that this little side quest was clearly intended to be part of the main game, since in the final cutscene Emeralda is a teenager no matter what. Then there's Rico. Poor, insignificant Rico. When Faye gets put into the prison camp in Nortune, Rico is the leader of the gang that runs everything. He is also the champion of that shitty minigame. Oh, what a good fucking champion you are. Remember how I said Rico is borderline useless in combat? That extends really well into his role in the plot. He kinda helps Faye escape. Well, he gets arrested by the leader of Nortune, Kaiser Sigmund, for attempted regicide. Faye and Saitan then break him free, but Rico has to make sure he kills the Kaiser for reasons. Also, Rico is secretly the Kaiser's son, but nobody knows it. Everyone leaves Nortune before killing him, and this never gets resolved. Seriously, Rico's subplot, which takes up around 5 fucking hours of mandatory game time, never gets resolved. I want to say that he sounds like he was intended to be an optional character, like you would go to Nortune and this would be a whole side quest bit, kind of like Yuffie in Final Fantasy VII, but they just put him into the plot because I guess they were really proud of it. The problem is that in Disc 2, there is an entire mandatory dungeon dedicated to getting him an Omnigear like he was supposed to be important. Instead, when you leave Nortune, Rico almost never talks again. But at least he's in the party. Don't worry everyone, Rico's here to help. The funny thing about Rico is that he is so worthless in combat that during the final boss, the only time you can take Faye out of the party. I tried having Rico lead the charge without Faye just for fun, but he just said, "Ah shit guys, I don't know if I can handle this without Faye." Now, any character would have done the same if you don't have Faye in the party, but my god, hearing that from Rico was amazing. The thing is, Rico is just an egregious symptom of the greater story issues that plague the entire narrative. Emeralda, Maria, and Choo-Choo are much the same in that the game clearly lacked a direction for what it did and did not need to be kept in. The things that were kept were the things that I suppose sounded the most interesting on paper, like having a Blanca ripoff or a giant Robo reference, but they weren't the things that are needed to keep the game a cohesive work. These are just comparatively simple additions too. We haven't even gotten into the issues with the core plot of the game. Tetsuya Takahashi has an interesting ethos when it comes to writing that I personally love and follow myself, but it has issues. Hiromichi Tanaka, the lead gameplay designer, has stated in interviews that part of the issue with development was that Takahashi would write the story as development was progressing. Takahashi himself has stated that by writing the game alongside development, it slowed everything down because no one knows exactly where they were going to be going and what will be important. One of the cooler aspects of this approach is that he in many ways can create these small details that interest him and flesh those out to the point that it makes the world feel like it's very, very detailed. It makes it feel more natural and not like a series of disconnected ideas that only exist to serve the plot. The massive downside to this style of writing is that it can get bloated very quickly. Takahashi was constantly adding new ideas to the game. I'm fairly certain that the entire Nortune section exists entirely because he thought about how that town would be in the game and then decided that there would be a really cool story in it if Faye got stuck there. He then decided to dedicate a lot of the dev time to it instead of, Disc 2? Tanaka stated that the game was originally planned for one disc, but after Takahashi kept adding more to the world, the game was made into 2, and most likely would have been longer had they been given the time and resources. As a result, the script never feels like it focuses on one theme throughout the whole of the game. Every idea the game presents is cool and interesting, but they tend to disappear in favor of a new theme every dozen hours or so. Ostensibly, it's a story of how power is a tool that should not be given to anyone with impunity, and the only way power should be used is for the benefit and goals of the masses rather than personal goals. The game is also about recovering from trauma or loss, depicting the various ways in which different characters cope with it, some more violent than others. In another way, the game is about how humanity needs to free itself from following any theology, as removing oneself from the confines of theistic destiny is the only way that humanity can truly achieve anything meaningful. All of these are valid themes that are present in the game in one way or another, but none of them are very well thought through, nor are they woven together well. From the beginning of the game, there is a clear intention to discuss the nature of power. Faye's accidental destruction of Lahan and Graf's entire existence are both a clear indication of this. Faye has uncontrollable power, and he also has a second personality that is fueled by rage. He resents that he even has that, and the closest thing to a motivation that Faye has for the first 20 hours is that he wants to ostracize himself for killing everyone in Lahan. This power is too much for him, and if it primarily manifests as destruction, then what is even the point of having it? Bart is the first person to really challenge Faye on his approach to his own power. See, Bart believes that those who have power and refuse to use it are hypocrites. Power is a thing to be used for good, and he immediately convinces Faye to use his power well. No, seriously, Bart tells him that power should be used for good and not wasted, and then Faye sulks for like 5 minutes, and then he becomes resolute in using his power for good. Then, way later, when he learns about id, he just decides that his power is too much and he should just go away. So Faye overcomes his issues with his natural power and then decides to just have issues with it again after like 30 hours. He goes through the same emotional issue twice. This kind of ruins Faye's character, but it also ruins Graf's value as a villain because his whole shtick is trying to make Faye use his powers for personal gain and destruction. So after Faye overcomes it, that part of the emotional conflict is over. Graf then becomes a novelty as he isn't emotionally relevant to Faye's personality anymore. This is probably why Faye has to go through that same development twice, because otherwise the discussion of power just stops at 7 hours into the game, and Graf is just completely meaningless beyond being a gimmicky boss. He is still the best character in the game, though. The thing about that, though, even if it does ruin Graph, there were actually other really good things going on for the story. After the game moves on from discussing the nature of power when Bart kinda kicks that issue away from Faye, it starts to frequently discuss the trauma that tends to shape people's lives. This is honestly the best part of Xenogears' writing. Faye has PTSD from murdering people he held close to him. Bart has been dealing with the subjugation of his home country and the torture that he suffered as a child under the hands of Shakan. Simultaneously, we learn about Ellie's trauma during her younger years, under supposed experimentation by the Solarian Empire. We start to slowly learn about the trauma that the entire cast has been dealing with, most stemming from either some kind of parental abandonment, and torture. Dealing with trauma that occurred during childhood is the primary thing that almost every single character deals with. Even the vast majority of the villains deal with some level of trauma that they endured. Graph's girlfriend died in a tragic war. Krelian's crush died in a tragic war before he ever got to fuck her. Ramses was literally thrown into a dumpster as a fetus. Even fucking Rico has personal trauma since his father abandoned him at a young age and his mother died when he was 10. Everyone deals with their trauma except for Faye. Faye has trauma, but he doesn't have to confront it. Theoretically, Faye has to confront the fact that he killed all of his close friends in Lahan. That and power are really the only two things that he talks about before he meets Bart. One of the few survivors of Lahan, Dan, the Forehead Master, even shows up during a tournament early on to call Faye a total bitch and a murderer before disappearing for almost the entire game. This is a great idea that never gets seen through to completion. Dan disappears at the 8-hour mark and doesn't show up again until the very end, where he sees it and says, shit Faye, my bad, didn't realize you were two people, you didn't murder my sister. And then Faye just doesn't have to deal with it. He never actually has to reconcile with Dan. Despite how in one way or another, everyone else has to deal with their trauma, Faye just gets a free pass. He's forgiven without ever actually doing anything. He just stops having to care. The worst part is that the game actually invents new trauma for Faye to deal with instead of having him overcome the issue that we've known about since the very beginning of the game. When he confronts Id, we learn that he was created as a way for the child Faye to deal with his mom fucking torturing him. This is not an issue that the Faye that we know actually carries with him during the plot. We're told this way too late to ever actually care. There are a couple hints that Id had to have been created due to some traumatic incident, but that part is so inconsequential to Faye's identity that it might as well not exist. You could have said that Id was a previous contact trying to take over Faye's body, and it would have had about as much emotional impact while tying into the overall core plot a lot better. So now we have a theme that every major character can relate to, except for the character that we as the audience are meant to directly relate to ourselves. So between power and trauma, there's a lot that kind of hints that there's this greater idea that Xenogears wants to talk about, but that's not the thing that Xenogears decides it wants to talk about at the very end. Ask anyone that played the game, and they will probably remember the discussion about God and religion a lot more than power and PTSD. The moment Disc 2 hits, the other two themes practically stop existing in favor of discussing God and humanity's relationship with such. That's the main thing people remember about the plot. I mean, I personally will never forget wasting 7 hours of my life in Nortune while nothing got accomplished and the worst character in the game joined my party, but the God stuff is a bigger part of my memory. So the core plot of trying to free the wave existence from the fleshly prison that is the Zohar is internally consistent within itself. but it's incongruous with the rest of the game as it suddenly becomes really important out of nowhere. The issue with most of the discussion of God is that it is almost exclusively talked about in the second disc. There is mention of Faye being the God Slayer at the beginning of Disc 1, and there are a few offhand references to the new coming of God by a mysterious group of people known as the Gazelle Ministry, but they are second only to Rico in terms of relevance to the plot, so who cares? Faye's motivation up until Disc 2 is a vague combination of wanting to use his power for good, while also seeing Solaris as the root cause of all things wrong with the world. This can naturally evolve in wanting to stop Deus, since resurrecting him is the entire reason that Solaris is evil. It just doesn't really flow from the previous themes is the problem. We go straight from Faye breaking down due to having too much power, straight into talking about his divine destiny, and it ignores how we were concerned about having too much power literally an hour ago. This is basically what happens at the beginning of Disc 2. Faye and Ellie become completely different characters. Not a lot of time passes between them, only about 3 weeks, and all of it was spent in a coma, but at the end of the first disc, Ellie and Faye are trying to run away from conflict to keep it in check while saving Faye from being frozen in carbonite. But then Disc 2 hits, and all of a sudden, Faye is highly invested in trying to save the world, and Ellie has decided to become Mary Magdalene. Apparently, 3-week-long comas really make you closer to God. And it's really, really annoying. Faye's desire to free humanity from its destiny of being food for God is actually incredibly compelling. Miang and Krelian's desires to bring God back via feeding him humans is very fatalistic. Faye, the party, and to a lesser extent of the wave existence, see contrastingly that the value in humanity is not in serving God, but in serving itself. It's sort of a free will versus determinism plot as explored through the eschatological ideas in religion. It's actually a very relatable topic, given that most major religions believe in a preordained end of humanity, be it the Christian rapture, the Jewish Aharit Hayamim, or the Islamic final judgment, or even Hindu's cosmic dissolution and then regeneration. I really wish that the game had focused almost entirely on it. Maybe ease into it with there being some religious people in early towns that talk about the coming of God, throw in a few doomsayers that are talking about how it's the end times, and you can even make the ethos, a small villain for Billy, a bigger plot point. Then you could have Miang and Ellie developed a lot better and have them work basically as separate prophets for the two opposing gods of Deus and the wave existence. Faye would then be Ellie's version of St. Peter, and Ramses would be the same for Miang. That way the religious themes are consistent from the beginning, they're more poignant, and the game doesn't cram tons of religious terminology at the player in the last 20 hours of the game. The worst of it is that Krelian suffers the most from this. His motivation is tied so strongly to the theme of trauma. His experience of dealing with Sophia's death 500 years ago, leading him to want to find a way to save humanity from itself and its violent ways. It's fairly compelling, but the power and trauma themes from Faye end up getting resolved during the final fight with Graf. That was the emotional climax of those ideas. Miang is the one that's closest to humanity's ultimate destiny, as she is literally an agent of Deus, but she has to take a backseat to Krelian, who is intended to be the final boss, but barely has any connection to these ideas of fighting against the destiny as declared from on high. The wrong villain is pulled to represent the wrong side of the conflict. And the issues with the theological ideas don't just stop at ruining a handful of characters. It makes the game really confusing because there are a ton of references to Abrahamic religions that feel more like name checks than anything meaningful. Here's a list of things that are named after something found in either the Kabbalah or Greater Judaism. You have the Raziel tree, the Zohar, Mahanan, Deus, who was originally named after the Tetragrammaton. I will not pronounce this as it is considered offensive to some people, but just know that this is supposed to be the proper name of God. The place where everyone in humanity was born was also called the Katamani. There's Cain, Abel, all 12 of Cain's children, Hawa, which is the Hebrew name for Eve. If you don't like Kabbalistic Judaism references, then shortly after everyone gets captured, they're crucified in Golgotha. Never forget the day Choo Choo died for your sins. And it gets so much worse in the companion art book Perfect Works. The timeline we are in is called Transcend Christ. Earth was renamed to Lost Jerusalem. The Zohar crashed in the land of Bethlehem. It throws so many names that it feels like they have to be meaningful, but it never does anything with them. By the Zohar being thrown into the land of Bethlehem, it makes it feel like the Zohar is somehow supposed to be Jesus, even though Zohar is supposed to be one of the foundational works of Judaism. You could have named everything after Norse mythology, and it would have had the same overall effect, except it would have sounded more appropriate for a fantasy setting. Actually, Perfect Works is probably the absolute best example of the issues present in the way that Takahashi wrote Xenogears and the overall plot as a whole. He has stated that Perfect Works was made of a lot of the things that he had already thought about and planned, but had never written down and didn't have time to add into the game. This includes a way too detailed account of the entire history of the Xenogears universe, including some parts that almost read like a summary of a completely different game that would take you through the lives of Faye's various pre-incarnations. There is so much information on Kin Kasim, the reincarnation that built Emeralda. It makes it seem like it was clearly supposed to be an important part of the game, but it barely ever comes up. There is so much extra information that the game has that makes it sound like it would be really interesting to write a wiki about, maybe have a few different stories that take place in the universe, and I think that's what Takahashi was going for, but I don't think he was a mature enough writer to realize what to keep and how much information was needed to tell one story. He decided to cram in so much into just one game, and it doesn't make sense on its own. It's borderline incomprehensible, and consequently Xenogears reads more like a massive lore dump instead of one story in a larger universe. It goes back to what I had called Xenogears earlier. Too ambitious for its own good. Takahashi wanted to make an amazing space epic that tells only one of many stories on that planet. He instead ended up telling the story of a group of characters that are a mixed bag of completely irrelevant to the greater story or have too many different conflicting issues to confront. The result is a game that seems like it should have been good, a game that by all means could have been one of the greatest ever made, but he didn't know how to do it, and his team wasn't able to act on his vision. I am by no means trying to say that I want to see his fully unedited work. Perfect Works is as close as it gets to his unedited ideas, and that is a jumbled mess of concepts that serve almost no point. Every good auteur-like creator needs a good team, and especially a good editor around them, so that their ideas don't get too big for the scope of their project. Takahashi, for better or worse, is a bit of a visionary. He was tired of the stories that games were telling, and he fully believes in the potential of video games to tell stories unique to the medium. That is what Xenogears was supposed to be. But the development of the game and Takahashi's ambition made it wasted potential. If there was more time to flesh out some ideas and more editing to cut out the robot fighting minigame, no, seriously, get rid of it, maybe the script could have been saved. But as it stands, Xenogears is a failure that I believe most people really saw the potential in. It is, by all means, a game that I can't easily compare to others beyond what Takahashi would later go on to make. Many JRPGs have gone on to have good and even great stories, but there's something about Takahashi's writing that makes the Xenogames unique, and makes Xenogears in specific so interesting to discuss. I do sort of wish I could have seen a full, if edited, version of the game. Takahashi has stated he always wants to make something very different from the last game that he created. And I think that's ultimately a good thing. Every work that he made in his 23 years of lead game writing has been dramatically different from the last in a multitude of ways. Xenogears might not have lived up to its potential. It's just far too messy and far too incomplete. But in the long run, failing both humbled Takahashi and made him a better writer and project lead. I haven't gotten to them yet, but after playing Xenogears, the Xenosaga series looks more and more fascinating to me since, well, it's a finished game. Hell, it's 3 finished games. But mostly I just want to see where the full path Takahashi made over the course of his career ultimately led him. Maybe there are a few more bumps along the way, but eventually, it will result in some of the best stories that any video game has ever told. Thank you. Oh boy! God, that was a mess to get through. Thanks for sticking through to the end. This was a nightmare to make, but it was really fun. Now I have to go play Xenosaga or something. Subscribe, support me on Patreon, follow socials, and all of that other stuff people on the internet ask you to do. And again, thanks for watching.